For nearly 20 years I've been part of a team of researchers, and we spend our time asking questions, sometimes ones that nobody else wants to ask. And it's because we want to understand better, and we just love spotting connections and teasing out causes. And we find that questions are usually easier than answers, and even some of the answers aren't too difficult. Why is it that sheep don't shrink when it rains? Why is it that they lock petrol station toilets? Are they afraid someone's going to use them? Some of the questions are actually a little bit more tricky. Some are historical. What was the best thing before sliced bread? This is topical apparently now in Texas. Why do they sterilize needles for lethal injections? And have you thought about this one? I really find this one very strange. Why isn't there mouse-flavoured cat food? Now, yes, it's good, isn't it? Do you want to try some afterwards? No. Now, because you are Messy Church practitioners, Messy Church thinkers and advocates, I really hope that my question today will be of interest to you. And it's this. In what sort of ways is Messy Church showing the way to the rest of the church? I lead the church armies. Yes, you're reading the caption below. It's a good idea, isn't it? I lead the church armies research unit, and we have done, I think, some study of this. What we've done is we've looked at over 325 Church of England Messy churches across half of the dioceses of the Church of England in the last 4 years. I think we can therefore be reasonably certain about certain patterns which are common to those young churches, at least in the Church of England. Forgive me, it's only the Church of England. I wish I was off camera at this point. The reason we did it that way is the Church of England is probably just quietly arrogant, and it prefers only to learn from itself. Possibly you're recognizing some truth here. Now, over the years, and I've begun to ponder this question, what is Messy Church doing in terms of showing the way? And that's partly through knowing Lucy, partly through extended visits to a few examples, as Jane has mentioned, reading other people's views, doing bits of writing like Messy Church theology along with others. And from all those sources, I want to offer you a few comments. And by putting my question in this way, I want to encourage you that Messy Church is taking a lead. You are exhibiting a number of factors, I believe, that the wider church needs to attend to. Now, perhaps this is because I think you are actually part of a wider movement. And that movement is raising two related and vital issues. The first one is this. How do we connect well with those beyond the church? That, you might say, is a question about mission. But how then is church to be reimagined so that that mission becomes credible? That is a church question. Now, I don't know which of those two questions come first. It's a bit like which came first, the chicken or the egg. Now, all I know about that particular conundrum is this. If you ignore one of those two factors, the other one won't last very long. So in my view, we need to avoid two equally serious mistakes. The first one is to think, if only we were to focus on mission, then the church question will look after itself. It won't. And the mission won't escape its present limitations. The second error is this, to think if only we spruce up the church experience, that in itself will accomplish the mission. It won't. It'll probably only make us more comfortable in our improved facilities and community. Well, here's my take on what you, Messy Church, and all its people are bringing to the rest of the church. When we wrote Messy Church Theology. Quite deliberately, the title had a double meaning. You could read it as Church Theology should include a positive view of mess. Paul Bayes' chapter particularly tackles that. Or you could argue the title was about this is a kind of theology of and for messy church. Now I want to highlight here this morning some of the sources of the presence of and the necessity for theological and human mess, and so why church life is bound to be messy, and actually that is acceptable. Now having a neat, tidy, nice church and its communal life is what some of us, by temperament, may hope for. Now, my wife might say, I am one of those people who is pedantically tidy. That possibly explains the sweeping syndrome. And she says, actually, I would attribute this to your German ancestry. For example, I am a person who, when I sit down at a place, I straighten out my knife, fork, and spoon, and then I turn my cup so it is 90 degrees to the plate. And there are people like me who can spend our entire lives adjusting untidiness. I'm glad there's one other person out there. So I can easily understand the attraction of a neat and settled church. Quite honestly, there would be so much less heartache, less arguments in committees, less difficult issues of discipline in the community, and people would be able to get on with the business of making a difference in the world. If the local church is in any way like a boat, it would be so much easier to row it or sail it if the people on board would stop jumping out, attacking the other crew members, or even drilling holes in the bottom of it. So why should we think mess is normal? Well, frankly, it begins with who we are. You might think that the founder of the Reformation, you could say Martin Luther, wanted to clean up the church. Indeed true. Luther actually taught that the Christian is, at the same time, a person who is justified and a sinner. Simul justus et peccator, if you happen to speak Latin. Now, the church today, and of every era, is only made up of justified sinners. We continue to be both. And that is what causes the problems. Mess is exactly what you would expect from such a combination. Now, once more, it was Luther, a plain-speaking, earthy individual, who likened the church to being simultaneously a hospital of sinners and a barracks of soldiers. Now, that is at least an untidy, possibly unpromising, maybe even paradoxical combination. And I have met church leaders who long only for deployable soldiers, and then project guilt onto the failing congregation made up of hospital patients. Now, I have also met church leaders, frankly, who have given up hope of finding any soldiers, and they find their value in propping up the hospital inmates. And the danger in the first group is to overemphasize the resurrection and triumph. The danger of the latter is to be fixated by suffering and almost liking despair. Here's another reason. The background to our lives is the story of creation and fall. The classic Christian view from Genesis 3 onwards, everything is both absolutely brilliant and spoiled. Nothing and no one is perfect. The sun shines, we smile, and then you get sunburnt. It rains, the crops grow, if you don't get flooded. Some people shine like saints, but they know their inner flaws. Most poignantly, people are beautiful, and some die early. The world is partial and incomplete. It has promise and frustration. This human incompleteness is actually inherent. Don't know if you've ever thought about this. Human beings, you will have thought this, are in the image of God, but it takes two genders to express that. And simply by being male, I am both human, I promise, but in one sense I am less than human. I'm only half the story. Everything is provisional and time-tainted. The book of Ecclesiastes describes, even laments, the theme that nothing is perfect. Everything has but its time, and it's tinged with a level of futility. Nothing lasts forever, including the church and how it sees itself. I don't know if you know this, but the church's self-understanding is messy in the sense that it is constantly evolving in relation to its context. So, for example, one book by the theologian Eric J. in 2 volumes is this: The Church, Its Changing Image in 20 Centuries. The world, humans, the church, all of them are messy, untidy, imperfect, evolving, all from creation and fall. And then there's a third reason: the now and not yet kingdom of God. In a sense, this is the theological equivalent to the game now you see it and now you don't. There's a reason why the good things which come to us as signs of God's inbreaking are partial. They have this already and not yet character. We're encouraged to think that signs of the kingdom do appear, but signs can go sour. A splendid young church is born. All seems well, and then the leader goes off the rails. Or a person in the hierarchy and the structures just quietly throttles the life out of it. It may be that promising things which seem to be so life-giving are only partial. There are some days when the door to heaven is open. The presence of God is obvious. The love in the community is palpable. The serving is sacrificial and authentic. And then, in the very same church, at other times, bitter conflict can break out. Vision is disputed. The members erect a glass ceiling on what can happen either by fear or distrust or undue introspection. Or it might be that young churches, of which Messy Church is one, because of their very youthfulness, lack the maturity, the stability, the sustainability, the gravitas that surrounding older churches may ask for. Why expect this conundrum of hopeful signs combined with disappointing results? We are taught that the nature of the kingdom is that it manifests as now and not yet. Jesus, I think, reflected that in 2 statements. He taught his followers that we are to expect that the kingdom is near. And at another time he says, pray that it will come. So we live with promise and foretaste and frustration. That's normal in the kingdom. Why not in the church too? Messy Church, by its very name, models that. And then there's now and yet, not yet salvation. Let me put this in personal terms. I have been saved from the penalty of sin. Decisive shifts have happened for me by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. My status has changed. From condemned to freed, from guilty to declared innocent, from enemy to friend, from outside the family to being inside it. It's a change of status. It is done. Thank the Lord. But then I am still being saved from the power of sin. There is a discernible change in my experience. I am not all that I would wish to be, but thanks be to God, I am becoming different from how I was. I'm starting to look and be more like Jesus. I confess to you it is an up and down and up and down story. So I identify with St. Paul, his inner conflict, which he acknowledges in Romans chapter 7. And yet I taste the tremendous hope that he talks about in Romans 8. I am living precisely now in a now and a not yet world. We are all messy but changing people. And the extraordinary thing is I will be saved even from the very presence of sin. I actually look forward to the end of my time on earth, when there will be the most glorious change of environment and of my internal disposition. I'm not sure which is the greater miracle. God's redeeming work in me will be complete. I shall then be who I was always supposed to be. It is more than I can fully imagine. That prospect is real, but it is not yet. So salvation is messy too. It is complete and incomplete. Not least there is the struggle of the middle stage. I nearly said age, but that's only partially true. And then there's now and not yet journeying with God. I have begun it. I recognize I've been called into a life with Christ as one of his disciples, or in other words, as an apprentice of Jesus. That is my identity. I am set on the road of following him, and so the spiritual disciplines lie there before me, and now has begun. And I am still on the road. I am indeed very often painfully aware how much further there is to go. My now is mingled with a not yet. But as I read the Desert Fathers, I find there a community of people and spiritual masters who were equally tough on themselves and yet very generous to others and unwilling to condemn them. And for such a long time it has been characteristic of the more spiritual that the further in or the higher up they go, they say how much further there is still to go. They model a hope, but they refuse to condemn others. The now, the not yet, are very present. And I will be, finally, fully united with Jesus. But that's a not yet. The prospect is entrancing. Paul puts it this way: we shall know even as we are known. Well, perhaps even more striking than that knowledge is how John puts it. We shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. All the not yet will then have become now. So, this messy, incomplete framework affects so much of Christian doctrine and living. If it is true personally, surely it is true corporately. If it is true about who we are, about creation, about kingdom, about salvation, about spirituality, I ask this question: why not of the church too? Now and not yet church is entirely normal. Messy is normal. So I'd want to say the church in Corinth wasn't the church on the naughty seat of the early church class. It was just normal. Now that doesn't mean anything goes. Not all messes are desirable. But let's have some slack. Perhaps a helpful balance on mess and growth in the local church is quite hard to do. Let me put it possibly as two aphorisms. Let the relaxed beware of saying bad behavior doesn't matter. It does, because toxic mess affects other people, and it reflects badly on God. Paul's not afraid to point that out in the Corinthian correspondence. But also, second aphorism, let the conformists beware of the trap of joining the Pharisees. Then you get a very dangerous substitution. It occurs by being content with outward conformity and social control, but it can ignore the dynamics of inner spiritual transformation. Now, we have in the West, and even in those bits of the West that we've exported to the Antipodes, etc., a particular history. And historically, and until recently, the dominant models of the church in the West have been institutional and hierarchical and managerial. And what do they prize? Order, neatness, even conformity. Thank you for bringing mess into what can be sterile and outwardly clean and only ostensibly nice. In my own denomination, the Church of England, there is said to be an 11th commandment. And it says, "Thou shalt not offend." Radical questioning of past church culture is seen as rocking the boat. Thank you for daring to be different. Thank you for daring to name being messy is normal and to champion that. Now, lest you die of self-congratulation, I now have a little bit of group work for you. I think probably actually group work is going to be a euphemism. We'd spend unnecessary time forming groups. Just have a look at your neighbour, and if you don't die, that'll do nicely. And I guess you've got maybe 8 or 9 minutes. Just begin to play with that question. It's not an easy question, but perhaps it's a good one. Well, I hope you enjoyed playing with the question. Here's the second thing I'd like to explore with you. Messy Church has got a very clear DNA. The English language is full of images and analogies. It's raining cats and dogs. He's a bit of a bull in a china shop. She won in a landslide. Do you know, even talking about an exit from Europe is a picture. The UK is geographically where it is, not lurking under some bush in the suburbs of Brussels. Well, to say Messy Church has a DNA is an image or an analogy. But partly it says you really can know what the heart of Messy Church is all about. DNA is shorthand for its essence. But it's also shorthand for what can be handed on to the next generation of Messy Churches. Just as I have DNA from both of my parents, and it has shaped me. And now, moreover, something of that also now exists in my 3 children. Both of these 2 ways of applying the DNA picture can be helpful. Well, what is the essence of Messy Church? To know what something is, you also are helped by knowing what it isn't. So we're going to take a domestic example, and when you know what the answer is, put your hand up. And the answer is not Jesus or an elephant. But you may put your hand up as soon as you feel fairly confident about what it is I'm describing. Well, you find it in a house and it has 4 legs. Now already you know it's not one of the children. But it may not yet be clear to you, is this a piece of furniture or is it a creature? I'm going to tell you some more. It's got fur and it's got a tail. Aha! And, well, you might still be thinking, well, it could be an animal. No, it couldn't be an animal, unless it's one of those stuffed ones that, never mind. Now, I'm telling you some more. It likes to jump up on the sofa and to be stroked. So it's not your wife. No one's putting their hand up. You're afraid of being caught out, aren't you? Yes, quite right. Well, if I said to you, you daily take it for a walk. Okay, so it wasn't a hamster or a cat, it was a dog, and there's one I did own earlier. Yeah, actually it was very unfortunate. We had her many years ago because of an Oxford connection. Her name was Isis. That wouldn't go down terribly well now. But those people who did rowing, you know, they knew what we were talking about. Well, this animal was like others, fur, tail, etc., lives in a house and so on, but was also distinctive. So what something is and what something is not is also important. So Messy Church exists alongside inherited church. And for some people, you will know, there is a live question. Is it church or is it not church? And part of the problem is that it is both similar to inherited church and different from it. Messy Church, as you will know, can be boiled down to several values, and they can be even further distilled into particular statements. Each one of them contains what it is, but I'm going to suggest to you also what it is not. And I've gone a little bit beyond the official list, and I think I've got a papal dispensation. Messy Church is for all ages, so it is not merely a children's activity. As a result, it aims for the transformation of family life. It is not simply fun for kids. Messy Church, hospitality is a conscious value, and now we have the definitive work. Hooray! It is not merely easy access. Messy Church is about creativity, not narrowly about craft, and the messy conversation with gathering round the men yesterday talked long and hard about that issue. Messy Church is about celebration, but I suggest to you that is about the whole of life, not just narrowly public worship. A Messy Church is Christ-centered. It is not a secular club. It is not even just theistic. As a result, I would want to say Messy Church is about mission and worship and community. It is not a bridge back to real church. It's so nice speaking at the party conference. People agree with you. But I think as you look at that combination of factors, you will see how Messy Church is like the rest of the church, but also how it is different from other expressions of church. And there are only expressions. Now, for every expression of church, there is a temptation, and it is to focus on the external distinctive features. In the Old Testament, an example would be circumcision. Later, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for their reliance on external marks of piety. Church history contains many bitter fights about forms of leadership, what are the right forms of worship, who is authorized to do what, a whole host of external values or features. Perhaps in Messy Church, we will face a temptation if we focus upon our craft or on the mealtime. Many of your values do have an obvious outturn that's a good thing. It helps if values start to become visible. But I'd like to suggest to you, actually, the least visible value actually is the most important one, though it is also at the same time the most elusive. I suggest to you it is about being Christ-centered. Now that is needed because although the other values are heartwarming, they are evocative of what it is to be human. You could find each one of them in a secular group or another world faith. They are not necessarily Christian. And yet with Christ, I want to suggest to you they gain a particular taste. Why do hospitality? Because it is derived from God's hospitality shown to us in Christ and the character of welcome he always gave unlovely people. Why do creativity? Because it reflects the joyous riot of the Trinity's untidy but deliberate creation and the creative way Jesus reinterprets the Old Testament. Or yes, all age springs in part from God's image being found in all people, but we also hold it because the body of Christ includes all kinds of people at all stages of being human. And why? celebration? Well, for Christians, it is rooted in the triumph of the resurrection, the beginning of the arrival of the kingdom, and the joy of a life with meaning. The celebratory instincts for praise and thanksgiving will then be complete when? At the return of Christ and the arrival of the new heaven and the new earth. And why do discipleship? Because the whole point is encountering Jesus, following and becoming like him. Now, I know, facing the sharp question, what are we going to do at Messy Church next month? Too easily, the visible takes over and the least visible fades, and sheer pragmatism and surviving till next month rears its head. I suggest to you this is exactly the same temptation which attacks a music group in a charismatic church, the precentor of a cathedral, and a preacher looking for new jokes. And I suggest to you, yes, rejoice in your external differences, like the all-age fun, like the creativity, like the meal, but every so often go back to the heart. Is this Christ-centered? Is our team living this value? How is encounter with Jesus being shown and modeled and pursued? So something from your DNA, the heart of who you are. Something also about handing on the DNA. Earlier on I said this DNA analogy reminds us there is something to be handed on. And that reminds us, however much we hand on, we are never our children, they are never us. And there are three my wife and I made earlier. In the longer Messy Church story, I think there are good examples of both inheritance but also difference. Some of you may know of the two trashy churches in Kent, where the creativity value is expressed in recycling materials, hence trashy. Or the example of Sweaty Church that did run for some years in York, where the style was based on kinesthetic learning, or in men's speak, doing things, rather than craft. I want to say to you, we should expect variety across Messy churches. So from the 336, it so happens, examples we researched, we know the frequency varies. Yes, 88% monthly, 7% weekly, 6% fortnightly. None of those is wrong, they are just different. We know too now that they choose different locations. In our set, only 37% actually met in the church building. There can be good reasons for doing that and bad reasons for doing that. You decide in context. They select also different days, 46% on the weekday, 34% on Sunday, 19 to 20% on a Saturday. Most of them, as far as I can see, are in the afternoon. Some are directly after school, others are deliberately later, some also are in the morning, and indeed there may be other patterns I don't know about. Midnight Messy Church I haven't yet met. But all of those decisions affect what sort of food, how much food, and what point perhaps you will offer food. People work out what suits the context and the resources that they have. Messy church cloning should not happen. Now, from watching the wider church for over 20 years, I see a temptation. The more that the church is desperate to do something, and I think it is, and the more any approach seems to offer something and achieve something, then the stronger the temptation to copy the external shapes and to miss the values. I saw this with Cell Church. The emphasis on the shape of the evening, the 4 W's, if any of you remember that stuff, but not the values that were beneath it. The shape does not deliver the values, any more than a skeleton brings life. But again, turn that round. I am finding this morning having a skeleton is quite useful. And it kind of aids me standing up here, but the skeleton itself does not create that life, it supports it. Your external shapes, I suggest to you, are something like that. Now in Messy Church, because you have such a clear DNA, you've got a real chance to show the wider church that it is values, not shapes, that are primary. And I say to you, know your DNA, trust your DNA, do not be in the slightest bit surprised that a resultant diverse Messy Church family will be the result. Again, time for you to do a little bit of work. There are 3 questions there. You won't go through them all. Please don't spend all your time having a referendum which of the 3 questions you want to go for. Just go, I want to do 1 or 2, and so 10 minutes, okay? Have fun. Okay, let's tackle the next topic. I want to suggest to you that being church is far more than worship. In my view, for far too long, the church has overemphasized the centrality of public worship. Now, of course, God is worth all that we can possibly give to him of ourselves. I just wonder, is this emphasis on public worship not only something to do with Christendom, but something to do with so much theology being written by the clergy? Now, in Messy Church, quite rightly, there is celebration, but it's only one element. I'd like to suggest to you what I think you model is actually the centrality of community through a Messy Church meeting. And the priority of community begins in the hospitality of the welcome. It underlines the partnerships of activity in the creativity. It creates the safety within which the fun of Messy Church happens. And all of that then is taken into the celebration, including the mix that it comes within a matrix of all ages. And then community is yet further underlined in eating together. As I've looked across what numerically are the 13 most common different kinds of fresh expression of church, 10 of them include food. Now, of course, food attracts, but in one sense, it's a bit of a byproduct. We do food because we are community, and then, if you like, that turns round, and food builds community. I think from watching various kinds of fresh expressions of church, I've come to think that community forming around Jesus is what is central to being church, not worship. Now, I'm aware that that represents a significant and for some people extremely contentious reimagination of what it is to be church. Yet I'd like to suggest to you it is at least suggested by a number of factors. One of them is that we're learning the language of going to church is just no longer enough. What actually is central is encounter with Jesus. Now, that language of encounter has actually been used by the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, at least for the last 10 years. And you may have noticed at the end of 2013, Pope Francis, in Evangelii Gaudium, writes something similar. And it fits with thinking that church people are not mainly attenders, they are disciples of Jesus Christ. Here's another factor. Coming to public worship is not inherently Christian. Muslims, Hindus, Jews, football supporters, well, all do the same. What is distinctive is a community of whom Jesus is the center. Because he has chosen us, because he continues to meet us, because he is transforming us, so we worship him. When Jesus pervades the rest of a shared communal life, the worship has remarkable authenticity. I think as a curate, I began to notice that the parishes I was part of had a kind of annual weekend away or something like that. And characteristically, the last worship event of the entire weekend, something additionally transcendent and wonderful would happen. Why? Because I think we had spent the whole weekend together. The worship grows out of the community. I'd want to say then, worship is actually the consequence, not the cause, of the covenants that God makes with us. You see that, for example, in Exodus chapter 20. The Mosaic covenant between God and his people is laid down at the beginning of Exodus chapter 20. That then is only followed by various chapters laying out regulations for worship. It doesn't begin with that. This emphasis on community is shown by a whole range of different kinds of fresh expressions of church. And even by the very way they form. Firstly, through embodying community, then exploring what the mission in that community is called to, and only at the end of the process beginning to evolve what sort of worship might be appropriate in that mission and of that community. I think you are showing the way, yes, with others, that community around Jesus is actually the heart of the matter. Now, one of my more recent discoveries is to think this, and forgive me if you were here long before. I'd like to suggest to you that let all of the values affect all the stages and the shapes. And there was an example in Manchester that helped me realize this. Let me tell you something of the story. The Messy Church in Harper Hay had been going several years. It was drawing quite good numbers because it was building on a longer history of a previous kids' carnival. But Harriet and Joel Atkins and Grace Forster knew that they struggled to make the celebration bit take off in an area where formal education is not a high value, where there is high absenteeism from school, and indeed it is a non-book culture. Now, the local people were extremely comfortable with the hospitality. They enjoyed doing things and making things, and they enjoyed eating together. They participated fully. And then all that changed as the leaders determined the worship, and you might say, did the worship to them. Just like, of course, happens in most churches. Now, using the skills of another team member called Alice, what they began to do was run music workshops. They asked the community to write down their prayers, their poems, their songs, which they then put to secular tunes. The Salvation Army will be laughing all the way to the bank. And they found that it worked not only for the adults, but for the teens and for the children. Now, they also chose themes for the celebration that resonated with that social area. An example would be, it is an area which suffers from quite a lot of petty crime. So there is a live question, who actually can you trust? So is God trustworthy? What is God's character? And as they were telling me the story, I suddenly caught on. What was proving effective in the celebration actually was the creativity about what was being expected and asking for it from the whole of the community. And the trust and the risk behind that creativity actually was an attitude of hospitality, truly welcoming all that those people were bringing, not just who they were. Now, technically, it was the celebration, but it was the other values all the way around Messy Church that was bringing it life. Maybe it's a thought. All the values can affect all the shapes and the stages. In such a way, I think you are showing a way. Thank you. Messy Church, I suggest to you, is making an impact. I hope it won't create the wrong sort of pride in you, but Messy Church is playing a significant part in a wider movement which I believe is of God, which we call Fresh Expressions of Church. In our team, we've spotted no less than 20 different kinds of fresh expression of church. Some of them overlap with one another, others are very distinct. One standout fact, Messy Church is the most frequent choice taken. You make up 30% of all the fresh expressions of church in the 21 dioceses, half the Church of England that we've surveyed. The messy churches are twice as common as cafe churches, 3 times as common as the church plants, 5 times the number of the youth churches. Now, there are a number of ways to show their missional impact. One of the questions we ask is, how many people did you take to start it? And then we say, and how many people would you now say on average are coming? And the ratio between the two we call the growth ratio. Now, along with other kinds of fresh expressions of church which also provide well for children, Messy Church is seeing 3.5 new people come for every team member you send. But the average across fresh expressions of church as a whole is only 2.5. You are doing significantly better. Now, we also ask the leaders of each fresh expression of church to estimate what is the percentage of the attenders who are Christians already. What is the proportion of those people who are returning to church after some gap? They may have left as children, teenagers, adults. We call them the de-churched. And what's the percentage of people who really don't have a church background at all? We would call them the non-churched. And we can then comment on how the different kinds of fresh expression of church seem to do better or worse across those 3 groups. Messy Church scores second highest in getting the non-churched. Why does that matter? It matters because this group is the largest proportion of the population, and it is the growing proportion of the population. It is no accident that the 4 kinds of fresh expressions of church with the highest proportion of non-church attenders are all significantly drawing children and young people, because in the population most of them are non-churched. Messy Church also has among the lowest proportion of transferring existing Christians. Now, that's especially noteworthy because in this kind of church you tend to need a larger team than some other kinds of fresh expression of church. Sweeping up last night, I began to see why. I didn't think I got all the glitter, but 80%. Now, that shows in the figures this thing about what team size do you take. The typical size of team taken to begin any fresh expression of church is actually 3 to 12 people, not a lot. That's the most common choice, about 70%. But the messy churches are top of the list for taking 13 to 19 people. And with an average size of a messy church of about 52, but roughly half and half adults and children. I think it's all evidence that the messy churches are not fundamentally about transfer growth of existing Christians, or even so much about winning back those people who had a church background already. That group only makes up 1/5 of those who attend these messy churches we've researched. Let me end this bit about a few stats in this way. I believe you're having an impact on the question, who can lead a church? You are part of a group of kinds of fresh expression of church that make it very clear it can be done by lay people. We now have enough data to dig into that and say, but actually, do the clergy do it better? And the answer is, it doesn't make any difference. The only thing they have a marginal advantage about is the holy hands and the table bit. Sorry, communion. Well, so what proportion of messy churches are lay-led? The answer is 61%. There are great clergy leaders of messy churches, great lay people who lead messy churches. Now, of all the leaders, lay and ordained, 75% are women. I think I might have anecdotally picked that up through this conference. Only Church for Under Fives has more. But not only that, by comparison with the other more common kinds of fresh expression of church, the messy church leaders are the most likely to be doing it in their spare time and on a voluntary basis. Give yourselves a clap. As far as I can see, that was the New Testament pattern, and for a good number of decades after that. Now, of all the lay leaders, and indeed of all of the leaders, you have the highest number of the group we call the lay, which sounds like a kind of Chinese ecclesial dish, doesn't it? We have spotted through our work, you've got 52% of them. We've spotted a kind of leader the church has frankly not seen for a long time before. Unapproved, technically, not unapprovable, unacknowledged, nor trained, nor licensed. Messy leadership, you might call it. Oh, and just by the way, the mortality of messy churches amongst the lowest. 3.7%, the average is 10%. Hard to know whether that's good or bad. Compared to start-up businesses, it's remarkable. Compared to infant mortality, it is shocking. How do you know? So I want to say to you, thank you so much for showing the way. You are part of reasserting messy is normal in Christianity. You are modeling that values with a clear DNA are essential for self-identity and the capacity to hand that on non-identically to the next generation. You are also good at trusting the DNA, which then helps the non-identical continuation of the species. You clearly exhibit that worship is only part of being a church. You are part of a disturbance in our day that shows the fresh expressions of church are making an impact, and you have a notable story within that picture. I thank you so much for listening.